right, welcome. Good evening, everyone. All right. I'm Jasleen Coley. I direct the Critical Race Studies program, and it is really so wonderful to see so many CRS alumni here. Alumni in the audience, can you raise your hands? So students in the audience, definitely reach out to the alumni. After the event, we're going to have a reception with some drinks, some light refreshments. Please stay afterwards, join us. People say that I'm a little biased. I don't think so, but because really CRS students and alumni are some of the most interesting, smartest, most passionate, compassionate, and kindest and most interesting people around. So I hope that you're able to stay a little bit and get to know one another. I am going to, because we have so many amazing panelists tonight, and of course there were so many alumni to choose from, that was really difficult. So this is just a small sampling of the incredible wealth of experience that our alumni have. So I'm going to keep this short and turn this over to Professor Nanda. And just also say we're really lucky to have Professor Nanda, who is going to be moderating this panel. So yes, I see a lot of people nodding their heads. Who here was one of Professor Nanda's students, actually? Raise your hand. So yeah, so quite a few. So Professor Nanda has trained many cohorts of CRS and PILP students. She has been a long time core faculty member of both the PILP program and the CRS program, and has also served as one of our faculty co-directors. And really, as far as someone who has dedicated her life to anti-racist lawyering, I don't think we could have chosen a better person who really personifies that work and really is very thoughtful about it. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Professor Nanda, and I will look forward to chatting with you guys after the event at the reception.
Very sweet. I thought because it's Dodger night tonight, we'd start with a Jackie Robinson quote. Jackie Robinson said, "Life is not a spectator sport. If you're going to spend your whole life in the grandstand just watching what goes on, in my opinion, you're wasting your time." So tonight we're honored to have all graduates from UCLA Law. How about a round of applause for UCLA Law School? These are all graduates who are in the game. They're not just in the sidelines. They're in the mix day to day, doing the good fight for racial and social injustice. And they are very busy people, as you read from their bios and as you heard from them tonight. And we're really honored and lucky that they all took time out of their busy day, all of them coming, I'm sure, straight from work to be with us today. So thank you to all of them. And on behalf of the Critical Race Studies program, I want to welcome you again, as Jasleen said. As many of you know, the Critical Race Studies program's motto is to do three things. Our goal, if you're in our program, is that by the time you leave here, you'll have accomplished three things, and that is to think new ideas, to reach future leaders and scholars, and to transform racial justice advocacy. And today you're going to hear from graduates who are really transforming racial justice advocacy. This is really an all-star lineup. Go Dodgers. And in many ways, they're part of CRS Praxis. Many of you have maybe heard us talk about CRS Praxis. So praxis is an ancient Greek word, I had to look it up too, that means is the process by which a theory, lesson, or skill is enacted, embodied, or realized. So today we're going to learn about how CRT theories are enacted, embodied, or realized. On the ground, real time, real practice, today. Like everybody's practicing today on the ground what they're doing. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to read their bios because we wanted there to be a rich array of people. We wanted this many people, but then that meant that we were not going to be able to do the traditional things we do in a panel. So I'm not going to read their bios. I am going to ask them, ask them to say their name and say who their clients are, just because that way you'll get a sense of the different ways in which they practice. And then they're free to answer. I gave them homework, and I gave them 5 questions, and they're free to sort of answer. They were asked to just reflect on these questions and answer them however they want to, and so the time is really theirs. And the goal will be that we will have some time at the end for Q&A. Okay, so that's how we're going to sort of run it. So these are the questions that I asked them to reflect on for tonight. And these would be the same questions that I would love to, if I could have individual, which I've had with some of them, conversations, I would want to know. So it's almost like if you can imagine a private one-on-one with each one, this is what I'd want to talk to them about. So this is what I asked them. In describing how you advocate, share how you approach the work to address systemic or individual racial or other bias. Be as specific as possible with cases or other examples. And if this question is not directly relevant to you, at least share with us your thought process about how this plays out in your day-to-day. Number 2, do you address systemic bias too in your work? And if so, how? If not, how would you like to if you could? That is, where do you see the holes in the work that you do? Third, if they haven't addressed it so far, how do you think about your work fitting into the larger movement to resist, especially given our current world? 4, how did your training at UCLA CRS impact how you approach the work, assuming that it did? And last, what do you wish you had learned while in law school? And I told them I know that that's going to be a very long list, but if they could just list 3 things, if they had up to 3 things that they thought they could learn. Because I really wanted this to be student-oriented, but also for you to get a sense of how thoughtful all of these individuals are. So the last thing I'll say is, there's many of you in the audience who could have been up on stage, so please know that there wasn't, these are not necessarily my favorites. Some of them, definitely a lot of them are my favorites. But it's that they're all, that we wanted to really give you a cross section of sort of the type of work that's happening in LA so that you could really see the wide variety of how you do this work and plays out. And also because every single one of these individuals, and I know them all personally, some and all of them pretty well, they're all very deliberate in the kind of work that they do and the kind of lives they lead. So I hope you'll sort of hear that and feel free, be sure to find them afterwards, assuming they can stay, and talk to them about how they chose the work that they did, the paths that they took, why they did what they did. Even asking them about what it was like to be a student, because I knew most of them when they were students too, and so when you talk to them, you'll hear that they probably went through a lot of what you're going through now and what you'll be going through in the future. So I want you really to see them as reflections of future yous. That was the point of this today. And I should also add, I don't know if Jesseline said it, this is the second event in the 2-part series that we did. The first one was on Charlottesville and white supremacy that CRS hosted, and we wanted a second one to be kind of on the ground, what's happening. So this is the on the ground. Sound good? Okay, so I'll have each of them say their name. We can just go in order, and maybe just tell everybody who your clients are, and then we'll get started with the order.
Sure. So hi, everyone. It's great to be back at the law school. My name is Oscar Espino-Padron, and I'm an associate attorney at Earth Justice. So my clients are primarily organizations, right? So I work with grassroots organizations made up of residents and communities that are affected. I also work with regional and statewide groups and organizations, and as well as national sort of nonprofit environmental groups.
Hi, my name is Nico Espiritu. I work at the National Immigration Law Center, and the clients that type of clients?
Your clients.
And so most of my work is involved what's normally termed impact litigation. So my clients really range depending on what the particular cases that we're bringing. It can be everything from an association of day laborers in a particular city challenging an anti-solicitation ordinance to individuals detained in immigration individuals detained in immigration detention centers who then serve as class representatives, to some of my most recent work involves not only representing families of refugees, but also organizations that serve refugees as well, like the International Refugee Assistance Project. And we often work with these clients because they allow us to bring challenges to kind of the systemic issues that we're attempting to address.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Jelani, Lindsey. I'm an attorney with the Federal Public Defender's Office, and my clients are indigent criminal defendants who are seeking counsel to litigate their matters in federal court. So we have clients who have criminal matters that are pending in federal courts. We have some who are having habeas matters, which are considered civil matters pending in federal court. So that is the client base that we serve. So folks who can't afford, for the most part, to hire their own attorneys in federal court.
Hi, my name is Joshua Kim. So we have my clients are a little bit special in that I work at a UF Life Reinjured project, and for some of you that know, for a lot of you who don't know, we have a monthly reinjury legal clinic where we help people with expungements and things like that. And a lot of our clients, I would say 90% of our clients are clients of the clinic, and we screen them for potential violations of the law that they may not be aware of. And then when we find those violations, we ask to represent them, and we bring litigations on their behalf. Sometimes using them as class reps, and other times, using their examples or cases as, a basis of factual investigation that goes forward from there. And the other 10%, I would say, are what I would call, I guess what legally is known as organizational plaintiff, namely, say, in an organization like All of Us and None, which is in a group of people with criminal records that advocate for their own civil rights, restoration of their own civil rights. And we work with them to bring impact litigation against usually government entities like probation, registrar of voters, county, court, governments,
And my name is Catherine Retana. I am a fellow at the LA Black Workers Center. And my clients are Black workers, both union and non-union, as well as immigrant Black workers. And we file employment discrimination claims on their behalf with the EEOC and the Department of Fair Employment and Housing as well.
Hi, everyone. Oh, I don't think my mic's working. I don't need it, though. I'm loud. It's okay. So my name's Devon Rios. Law Office of Devon Rios. I'm a solo practitioner. I represent families that need help accessing the education system. I do primarily special education work, which means I represent students ages 3 through 22 in the K through 12 system that are facing discrimination or are not being provided the appropriate services under the law called the IDEA. So I work in a lot of schools. I sue school districts, and I work for myself. So we'll talk about all that.
Greetings, my name is Hussain Turk, and I work with the Los Angeles HIV Law Policy Project, where I serve people living with HIV in Los Angeles County, primarily with regards to immigration, homelessness prevention, and economic justice. And we also do public policy advocacy. We just won SB 239, which decriminalizes HIV.
Good evening, everybody. My name is Jonathan Feingold. I work in the UCLA Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. I have 3 clients: equity, diversity, and inclusion. Somewhat more concretely, our office is jurisdictionally essentially covers students, faculty, staff, other academic employees, essentially anyone at UCLA.
Thank you, and we'll start with Devon.
Of course. So I made a big deal about order. I didn't want to go first.
Yeah, somebody give you one.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you. Cool. Okay. Is that better? Yeah? Okay, cool. So when the questions were posed from Professor Nanda, I'm usually someone that goes off the cuff with everything. Like, I'm prepared and I'll read and I'll do all that, but I usually don't prepare things up front. But when I really sat down and thought about race and my practice, I had to script it, because it was kind of like she was asking me, how do I breathe? It's something I do every day, and I'm so ingrained in the work that I do that it's not even really conscious anymore, especially because my clients aren't explicitly represented because of their race. There's a lot of intentionality in how I select my clients and the work I do and where I'm located. But I really had to think about it. So forgive me if I read a little bit, but that's how this has to go. So I started off at a nonprofit. I had an Equal Justice Works Fellowship, and I was aiming to serve students with disabilities in preschool settings. The idea being that if you got early intervention to address disability needs and access to quality services, outcomes would be better long term. And so that was the work I started with at a nonprofit. And I really I always wanted to focus on the cross-section between race and disability. So that was a focus at the nonprofit. Just to give you some statistics as to why that work is racially based, I have some 2011 stats about the funding of services from the Department of Developmental Services. So the average spent on a child ages 3 to 6 on disability-based services was $11,723. That's for a white child that has a disability. receiving public money for the various services they need. When compared to Asians, 11,063. Latinos, 7,634 per child. So this is just if you look at race. And blacks, $6,593. So just in terms of the way public money that belongs to everyone is spent, it's disproportionately spent on white children. There's a lot of factors that go into that, but I'll get to that in a second. So it is very racially based, because these public resources that belong to everyone are disproportionately chopped up. So the state's largest school district, LAUSD, and so that's where I play a lot. So affluent white students on the west side have supports and services such as like a one-to-one aid at the rate of 10 times of that of Latinos. So essentially, so my practice is in Whittier. That's the suburb of the east side, if you will. I mostly serve Latino and black families. It's very rare if I have a west side case. And that's very intentional. I set up shop where I did because that's who I want to serve, that's who I want to work with. That's who gets silenced the most for a lot of different reasons. And so that's just who I serve. All my clients are Latino or black, and that's just what it is. So that's why it's hard to kind of break down, like, how does that impact it? Because that's just where I'm at and what I do. So the stats, they point to race, but it's a lot more complicated than that. There's a lot of factors that go into whether a child with a similar profile, say autism, gets the behavior support they need versus a Latino student that doesn't. A lot of it has to do with bypassing gatekeepers. So these West Side schools that are used to dealing with affluent families, they can't gatekeep as hard. So those are families that have access to resources, they can pay for their own services, they hire lawyers, and that's just the way it works. The squeaky wheel gets the oil. Less affluent families don't have that luxury. They don't necessarily have a grasp on their rights. So I frankly enjoy that. I kind of love going into settings where it's not expected and ripping stuff up and kind of shaking up that. I love it. Like, the representing someone that's monolingual Spanish speaking, they don't understand. No one's made the effort to let them know a thing that's going on. And so to be able to rip that up it's fun for me. So that's kind of one takeaway. Do what makes you happy. That really makes me happy. To sit there and just kind of see some jaws drop, that's some good stuff. You got to find those little things that keep you going. And so it's about shaking up that complacency. And it's difficult because, frankly, most of the people sitting on the other side of the table are teachers, administrators, and they're all of color. So you can't sit here. It's really difficult. And a lot of people become complacent in the system. Families accept what they accept because that's what they think it is. Teachers lower their expectations. So a lot of the foundational work is about shifting that thinking from complacency to opportunity. It's all public money. So why not give that opportunity to a less affluent family? 3 minutes went quick, so I got like 2 minutes and some change. So, all right, so I mostly do individual work. I always have an eye towards systemic. So when I was open about 3 months, a file came across my desk for a family I've been working with for a really long time. And it was some beautiful documentation of illegal restraints and a student. So the student was essentially 8 years old, held down by 2 adults. His tooth was broken in the process. And this happens pretty common. It's not something that is uncommon, especially for students with behaviors. But somebody wrote down that the restraint was done illegally and inappropriately, and they produced it to the parent. Sometimes you have to litigate just to get those docs. It takes a lot of resources. So I had finally found the plaintiff, and it was the right profile and the right mix, the right community. And so that piece led to, we tried on the ground, we did a lot of community organizing, trying to get that district to change their policies and procedures. And so when that didn't work, it was litigated, and it was the first class action of its kind. These families are getting a little chunk of change, and they're reforming all the policies in this district. And I want to speak a little bit to remedies, being race conscious in remedies. Because once we got past all of that, man, that went quick. Once we got past all of that, remedies are another place where you have to be conscious about race. Selecting experts that are race conscious, that are culturally competent, it's important. So I will be quiet.
Thank you. Jelani?
So as a public defender, is my mic on? Can you hear me?
There you go.
All right, well, I'll tell you. So as a public defender, I think I deal with race on both the macro level and the micro level. So with regard to the macro level, you have structural issues that are inherent in the criminal justice system. You have school to prison pipeline, you have economic inequalities, you have all these other things that are kind of at play. So you have that's in the background. And then you have the individuals that you're dealing with on the micro level, dealing with individuals on a day-to-day basis. Let me put the mic closer to my mouth so you can hear what I'm saying. So I think that's what's interesting about being a public defender. I think more so on the micro level, I deal with race and trying to, I guess, disabuse people of the stereotypes that they hold. So in the work that we do, I think the main thing you want to do is try to tell your client's story. You want to try to humanize your client and make them seem like a person, because in a lot of instances, most people that are dealing with them in the criminal justice system don't see them as people. They see them as statistics or, perpetrators. So that's my job, is to try to convey their story the best way I can. So I think when it comes down to it, you have to deal with different actors in the criminal justice system differently. So for the judges, you have to try to make a compelling case to the judge as to why your client's rights are important and significant, and factually why your client is entitled to some type of relief, or at least some type of leniency from the court when it comes to sentencing and things like that. Juries are a little different. You're dealing with people who are lay people who don't know the law, but they come into the situation with biases and they perceive certain people in certain ways. So you have to try to make them connect, or enable them to connect to your client, to see that the client is not much different than they are. And so I think that's the work that's important. And it kind of goes down the line. We deal with probation officers, pretrial services officers, which is kind of, if someone's on bond, they're on pretrial release. And even in that sense, it's about relationships and making people see your client as an individual as opposed to just, a statistic. So I think that's most of the work that I do on a day-to-day basis. That's what I try to do, is try to convey my clients' stories and make them, humanize them.
Do you have a specific example of a case where you remember having to humanize your client?
Well, multiple examples. I'll try to make a composite. I don't want to, put anyone's information out there. I'm just joking. But I had a client who was charged with essentially breaking into an FBI office and destroying $1,000, or in excess of $1,000 worth of federal property. And so he was a Muslim individual, Muslim American, and he did it as a form of protest. And so everything that was kind of coming at him was like, this dude is a terrorist. And so we had to try to make it seem like, no, this dude is not a terrorist. He's just a very principled person. Like, you have to really kind of understand where he's coming from. He might not have taken the right approach in trying to advocate for what he was trying to advocate for, but, he is a human being. He's not a terrorist. And so in that respect, even with the judge, with the prosecutor, with the court, I mean, everyone was kind of like leaning towards that, I feel like, in my opinion. I might be a little jaded, but it seems like folks were leaning towards trying to label this individual as a terrorist instead of looking at him as an individual, someone who had served in the military, someone who had a family. And so if you could get the conversation away from these stereotypical tropes that people kind of rely upon because they're so easy to rely upon, because it's compartmentalization. That's how we kind of see the world, is through race. If it's not, if someone doesn't fit neatly into a racial category, it kind of throws us off. And so we want to make it so that you can look at this person as an individual. And that's what the purpose of the court system should be, is to individualize the process for people and not to lump everyone into one category. So that's what I try to do. So, I mean, that's pretty much, I feel my work in a nutshell.
And do you draw on your time here at UCLA? I know you did a master's degree and a law degree, but do you draw from that experience at all in your work, or do you find yourself drawing from that?
I think I do. I think just in interacting with people, having gone through the CRS program, meeting different people from different backgrounds, it makes me more able to understand where people are coming from. It makes me more compassionate, more empathetic, and I could see myself in someone else. We might not come from the same situation or circumstances, but at the baseline level, I think we are all the same. And so that's what we have to kind of just convince people of, like, there's not really much difference between you and I. It's just that we're in different circumstances. So if you could get someone to see it that way, then it makes things a lot easier for you in the criminal justice system.
And do you have any advice for budding lawyers?
I think everyone's path is different. When it comes down to it, there's no right or wrong way of doing anything. I think practicing law is like, it's a constant thing. You're constantly learning, so you can never really be prepared as to what you're going to do when you practice law. So you can take as many clinical classes as you want to, and I mean, I think that's great. You should do that, but the practice of law is different than being a law student. So just recognize that and be prepared for that once you come out and take the bar and pass the bar. So it's nothing is wrong with you. It's just that, it's a practice. It's not the perfection of law. It's the practice of law. So you're just constantly learning and working to become a better lawyer and a better advocate for your client. So just keep that in mind once you get into the, profession.
And how do you stay motivated to do the work you do?
It becomes depressing at times. It becomes overwhelming to kind of deal with the stuff that we deal with, because it's like you against the world. It's your client. And you against seemingly everyone else. So you just have to kind of recognize that you are pretty much the only thing that's keeping your client from being railroaded and pretty much tossed to the wayside. So just have to keep that in mind and let that be your driving force. It gets difficult at times, but you just have to kind of try to recenter yourself and focus back on that.
Thank you. Hussain?
Can everyone hear me? Oh, it's on. Okay. So the way that I approach my anti-racist lawyering practice is to center this principle that those who are most directly impacted by racism are or should be the primary architects of any solution to their problem. And so that kind of gets at this idea of equalizing the relationship and the playing field, which can never really fully be achieved. But one thing I really try to foster with whoever I'm working with is a genuine, authentic relationship. I think that one of the effects of white supremacy is to create hierarchy and elitism in all of our encounters and all of our relationships. And I think lawyering and being attorneys is one of those areas in which we see a lot of that elitism. So really breaking down that hierarchy and being able to connect with my clients on a personal level, which some people might find controversial or is challenging with regards to ethics, but really trying to see them and have them see you or see me. I work with people who are living with HIV. I myself have been HIV positive for almost 10 years, and that's something I disclose up front to all of my clients. And I find that fosters an element of trust and authenticity. One of the principles that we operate on at the LA HIV Law Policy Project is that folks who are living with chronic illness, such as HIV, deserve representation and counsel that is sensitive to that medical condition. Especially with HIV, there's a lot of stigma, and folks don't want to disclose, and folks feel a lot of shame and self-loathing and feel dirty, and there's a lot of isolation. And we know that when you're working with a client, if they're not disclosing one significant part of their life to you, then they're probably not going to disclose other facts that may be pertinent to that representation. So to have an attorney or counsel or legal service provider that you can trust with your HIV status creates that relationship where we can freely exchange information. So building that trust, and then that leads into doing emotional labor. And recognizing that the law doesn't solve all of the problems created by racism. In fact, as CRS students, we know that the law creates most of these problems. So if I want to do this work, I need to be prepared to do extra or non-legal work. And at the very least, I need to be prepared to connect my clients to housing resources, to social service providers, social workers, mental and physical health care providers. Because without tending to all of those needs, solving a legal problem really doesn't do much. And I say that with a grain of salt because every case is different. But for my clients especially, there is a lot more than just lawyering that goes on. And sometimes I find myself in a position where I'm doing that kind of counseling work, where I'm having to motivate my client and affirm them and create this very radically affirming emotional space. One example, I have a client who she was trafficked from Nigeria by an older white man who groomed her into a very sexually abusive relationship. And she came over here and contracted HIV, and every step of the way throughout her immigration case, and also she has a child support case and a restraining order pending. So every step of the way she gets very afraid, and rightfully so, of having to see her abuser. And she's very afraid that someone is going to find out that she has HIV and that they're not going to want to work with her, or that the judge is not going to rule in her favor because she has HIV. And so there's a lot of having to hold space and just be there and listen and provide emotional support that they don't teach us in law school. And that's one of the things I wish I had done more of in law school, is taking courses in different disciplines in different schools, in psychology, and I don't know what else would have been useful, but probably anything non-legal. And really learning how to come at a problem, a legal problem, from multiple perspectives and disciplines. Another thing that I have to do a lot in my work, and I think that we do as anti-racist lawyers, is advocacy, and specifically political advocacy. So I'm going to talk fast because I want to put a plug in for a project that I'm working on, and it's really important to me. There's a young man named Jamel Moore. He was 26 years old, black, gay, HIV positive. And he, because of all of the reasons we can talk about, was in a position of economic and financial desperation and began participating in sex work. And he had a client, a wealthy older white man by the name of Ed Buck, who is a major donor to the Democratic Party, not just in the city of West Hollywood or in Los Angeles, but across the country. And Ed Buck injected him with crystal meth against his will and killed him. And so imagine, if you will, a white girl from UCLA ends up dead in the home of a black man, and the police come and they find drugs. This man would have been arrested like that. He probably would have been dead, to be honest. Ed Buck was not arrested. There were drugs, there was a dead body, there's paraphernalia, there are text messages, there's emails, there's calls, there's so many receipts, but there was no arrest. And so right now we're really working hard because Jamel was HIV positive. We don't just represent a single client, we represent the community. And there were many other victims who were victimized by this man. So I'm working actually with another UCLA law grad, Nana Jumphy, who represented victims in the Grim Sleeper murders, which is actually very similar to this situation, but really pressuring the government to get the sheriff's department to arrest this man who killed a young gay black man who happened to be engaged in work that some people might find not respectable. So again, this goes back to the work that I do and I see as anti-racist lawyering is not just lawyering, but it's advocacy, and it's providing emotional and mental support, and really doing comprehensive grassroots work and centering those voices that are most impacted.
Thank you, Hussain. Oscar?
So at Earth Justice, I'm an associate attorney, as I said, in the Healthy Communities program. So that means I'm primarily involved in a lot of air quality, water quality issues, as well as some oil and gas work here in Southern California. And so I work primarily with overburdened, communities of color, made up of low-income residents, and I really work with them to support their efforts to counter particular projects that are being proposed in their neighborhoods. These are projects that are in addition to other sources of pollution that already exist, right? And as part of the work that I do, I really bring in my own personal background and experience and perspective to really inform the work and also the approach that I take. So I grew up in Long Beach, California, here nearby, and I grew up, near refineries out in Wilmington. I grew up near the ports with the thousands of trucks that come in and out daily. We have oil extraction islands off-site. We have oil extraction that takes place in residential areas in Long Beach. And we also have the LA River, right, which basically dumps everything that washes out into the Long Beach port area. And so I understand that sort of environmental racism and injustice that my clients experience. And so having lived that experience, as I said, it sort of informs my approach to the work that I do. One of the ways that it does that is it really ensures that I allow the community to set the agenda, right? To let us know what are the issues that they need us to work on. A lot of environmental groups, right? A lot of big greens, national nonprofit organizations, environmental organizations, come in and they have their own agendas, perhaps, and sort of dictate what the community should be doing. But I see it as, we should be looking at the priorities that the community has, working with the community to develop a particular case, or to combat a particular project. So really allowing them to sort of lead the efforts, set the agenda. The second way that my background sort of informs the work that I do is I like to bring in sort of the personal stories of my clients into the work. Where possible, I like to bring in sort of examples of the kinds of conditions that they're experiencing. I find that a lot of sort of litigation and legal advocacy tends to be very disconnected, right, from the people on the ground, the people who are experiencing the conditions. So I really like to bring that into the narrative, to the discussion, where possible. And I think it's a powerful tool as well, sort of as a political, as sort of it adds an additional sort of societal pressure, political pressure, in particular proceedings, right? So if it's an administrative process, having that perspective, that narrative in the petition that you're filing and the comments that you're submitting, I think adds another layer, right, of sort of pressure for the agency to do the right thing. And that's, in particular, it's a powerful thing to have when the petition, for example, that you're filing with the agency is a discretionary petition, right? And so the agency may or may not take up the matter, right, and address the concerns that the community has. But when you have those stories and you're able to communicate the kinds of conditions folks are facing, I think it's very difficult for these agencies to sort of turn a blind eye and say, we're not going to address that, when they have those stories and they feel the pressure. And sort of an example of that, it involves an oil drill site in South LA. We have a number of oil drill sites throughout the LA area. And there's this one site, for example, in South LA that's in the middle of a community of color, primarily Black and Latino, low-income community. And so we worked with the community to file a petition for nuisance abatement with the city. And these are discretionary petitions, right? So the city can ignore it, and they have, right? So they haven't really imposed the kinds of conditions that are necessary to address the health and safety concerns at that particular site. And that particular site has existed since the 1960s. And it has existed without the same conditions that are given to wider, wealthier neighborhoods on the west side that also have oil production sites. So we went in there, we filed the petition, we put in stories of the community and their concerns, the health impacts that they've experienced, the noise, the smells, the vibrations, the trucks coming through the neighborhood. We put the pressure on the city to grant a hearing to listen to the community, take in additional evidence, and we recently were successful in acquiring the strictest conditions ever imposed on any drill site in the Los Angeles area. So the community finally, has the same conditions, if not better conditions, than the white communities here in the city. So common sense things, right? If you're producing oil if you're extracting oil in the middle of a neighborhood, you would expect them to have, full enclosures. You would expect them to have emergency systems in place in case there's, methane emissions or any other VOCs being emitted that are going to impact the community's health. Things like vapor controls, fence line monitoring. So we were finally able to acquire that for the community, and again, it was through having those voices in our petition, working with the community, letting them lead the effort to pressure the city to do the right thing finally. Unfortunately, that's not the only project, right, that is of concern in this area. We have a lot of other issues here in Southern California. One of the other concerns that we have is, relates to the freight, right? So the ports are a big concern. The logistics development that's occurring in the Inland Valley. We have right now being proposed the largest warehousing facility in the world. It's 700 football fields big. It's near a community that already is experiencing a lot of other impacts. And so we're going in there and we're working with the community to address these concerns. I'll stop there. I could keep going.
Thank you. We could keep hearing from you too. You hear a lot of intersectionality, right, with these issues. You can imagine like the negative consequences of living in unhealthy air. The consequences are so huge, like most of which we won't even know. We might not even know actually in this lifetime how much the consequences are. So I'm hoping you're starting to hear intersectionality between all these issues and how they connect to one another. Catherine?
Working at the LA Black Workers Center, we do explicitly look at systemic race bias every day and individually. I started my fellowship before the election, and I think it was interesting to have my fellowship just change drastically after this election. I think every day it was just a different day. When I was talking to workers initially, we were filing our claims with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which is a federal agency. And once Trump came into office and we were having these meetings with our local EEOC office, and even when we flew out to DC to talk to the Office of Federal Contract and Compliance, that is actually created from this executive order from the 70s, just seeing that everybody's trying to jump ship and nobody even knows, what's going on with their job, and it's a very scary moment for you when you know your clients are depending on this, right? Sorry, but so every day, you think about that, and so we were making strategic changes every day. I'm sorry. It's just, And so during that time, we decided, the federal government is not something that is dependable. These executive orders can change any moment. We decided to approach California because we live in a state that is more pro-worker than others, but still has a long way to go, right? And so everything that was happening, we tried to create a push or use that momentum to push legislators in California to create this change, to hold the line on civil rights and employment discrimination. So through my individual complaints and through the research of what can we do for workers, what systems are out there, because as a Black Worker Center who does not have the capacity as, it's a very new organization that was born from the UCLA Labor Center. It's a project that was born from the Labor Center, and it's doing amazing work, and it's run by an amazing woman of color, Lola Smallwood Cuevas. And through that work and research that I was doing with doing direct legal services and also doing, policy and research, we decided that we need to, push California to do more, because the Department of Fair Employment and Housing has gone through so many budget cuts under Schwarzenegger, has been undermined in so many ways, and they have, an amazing director now, Kevin Kish, who was actually my boss when I started in law school, and we wanted to, really look at what can we do in California, and I think in the work that I did every day, every case that came in through my door, I was thinking, I knew it wasn't an isolated person, because I'm born and raised in LA. I know that discrimination is prevalent in LA. We're the capital of wage theft, so when I came into with every worker, I was meeting them with our community organizers, and every time we talked to them, I shared my story because I'm from this city. I know what's going on in the city. I'm a child of an undocumented immigrant, and also being a Latina in a Black worker center was an interesting dynamic because they, when they're talking to me, they don't know if they can trust me. They don't know who I am or what my story is. And sharing my story has always been the most powerful moment for me because I can connect with workers and I can also get to know their stories on different levels. And I don't think they probably ever thought they could have a conversation like that in a legal atmosphere. And so, when I'm meeting with workers every day, we think about how can we share this story? How can we humanize these workers when we're talking to legislators? And we invite workers to come with us. And we push for Senate Bill 491, which is going to allow local governments to enforce the Fair Employment and Housing Act. And it was through those claims, through those individual claims, that we were able to see those loopholes and find out, well, how can we make these systems stronger? How can we support those systems? How can we provide those resources? And what we felt was by having local cities that know their city and have resources and have systems in place, especially, in a city like LA where we have this fair chance ordinance that, was just passed. We look at a lot of the work that our sister organizations like A New Way of Life is doing, when we see how can we build off that momentum, how can we support them, and also, creating a holistic approach for workers where they don't have to go to the DLSC to file a wage theft claim and then go to the EEOC to file discrimination. It's exhausting when you don't even have a job, you don't even know how you're going to pay your rent or catch a bus. That it was a constant every day. Like Devon said, it is like asking yourself, how do I breathe? Because you do it so much that you forget that you're on this constant train ride. But one thing, going back to law school, that I wish we could stress more of is wellness. In a time that we are living in, I think it's so important to take care of yourself, to do something that drives you. And I think in the Black Worker Center, we really do try to push that a lot, and having events for our workers too, where, we can go out to the Crenshaw Jazz Festival or, because we need it, because it fills our soul, because it fuels our work. So I think that I'm going to end there. I think it's a really important point that I would want to stress to just, my colleagues and students that are looking to do this type of work. But it's really amazing work, and it's really fulfilling.
I'm gonna take the moderator's prerogative to make a plug for nonprofit organizations. Catherine hasn't been out of law school for very long, and you can already hear the number of different things that she's done. Some of the advantages to working in nonprofit right away is that you get to do a variety of things very quickly. So I'm just going to put in a little plug. That it's John.
So I believe we could reserve time for rebuttal. So I would like 3 minutes. I'm not sure what I'm going to be rebutting. So part of the call to question, and I'm hunched over in part because I can't get the mic out, the wire's stuck. Part of the call of the question is, how does CRT inform our work? And I want to begin, I guess, with an analogy. And again, to remind you all, I work in the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion here at UCLA, which is a central administrative office that our jurisdiction covers the entire campus. You would never be comfortable with an airline pilot who didn't go to flight school. You wouldn't want to hire a firefighter who had no practice fighting fires. We all experience gravity, but you don't want someone building spaceships unless they actually have some knowledge of physics, unless they're an actual rocket scientist. I think historically there's been an assumption that the quote-unquote diversity office doesn't need that level of expertise, in part because the sorts of racism, oppression, marginalization that occurs in sites like UCLA are actually not all that complicated. For some reason, it's actually a basic science. But how could that be right? And I think one reason why CRT is so crucial is because it exposes that this is not a basic science. In many ways, this is as complicated as any other rigorous, hard, deeply troubling and complicated phenomenon. And so I'll just provide a couple examples of the way in which CRT comes into play, and really it comes into play as a mode to disrupt common, quite salient lay theories, presumptions, narratives about how the world works and why it looks the way it does. And these narratives are so dangerous because they actually undermine the ability of good people, well-intentioned leaders, administrators, to actually engage in the sort of actually quite modest forms of institutional governance that would actually make a difference. So I'll give two examples, one that speaks to faculty and one that speaks to students. So our office interacts quite frequently with hiring committees across UCLA who hire the faculty at UCLA. It's obviously a role of incredible significance because you're constantly constructing, reconstructing the makeup, the human bodies that occupy this space. And in almost every conversation with respect to hiring, particularly in certain disciplines that continue to see pretty severe underrepresentation of folks of color, of women, there's constantly a claim put out there that it's a quote-unquote pipeline problem that most people in this room are quite familiar with. It's essentially a supply-side explanation as to why we have disparities. There simply aren't enough folks from these groups who are qualified. Now, CRT enters in a few different ways. And it, at base, just interrogates that notion. In part, it says, look, we get that there are all sorts of ways in which folks have different trajectories, and as a function of identity encounter different burdens, headwinds that impact access to resources, coaching. But let's pause before acting like this quote-unquote pipeline is some natural phenomenon that exists out in nature. Because what we know is that the pipeline is constantly created and recreated by decisions that we make, that hiring committees make. For instance, hiring committees, they have to narrow down a large field to a small field. So what do? They often will rely on proxies. Proxy to try to shortcut to identify who's quote-unquote smart. Obviously, CRT can say a lot about merit. I definitely don't have time to engage that, but so a proxy administratively makes sense. It's easier. But if you're an institution, if you're a department, and you really, maybe you look at 10 schools, but you're actually only hiring from 5 schools. By doing that, you're essentially relying on the judgment of the admissions officers in those schools and the factors that they found relevant to should or should not be in those schools. Factors that often reduce to a standardized test score that no serious academic would suggest is related to whether or not someone has the potential to be a serious academic. I do want to keep a couple minutes, so I'm going to stop right there.
Go ahead, Nico.
Hi, so I wanted to talk a little bit about my work, which, at least how I started off my work, which was very much in the field of kind of traditional race civil rights work. I began working at the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and then moved to the Mexican American Legal Defense and Educational Fund. And there, at both of these organizations, I was doing things that felt very much like what we think of as traditional racial justice civil rights work. Voting rights claims on behalf of Latinos in places like Modesto, or challenging Texas's redistricting plans that would intentionally discriminate against the Latino voters there. But much of my practice in recent years, and even earlier, really addressed what can be understood as the ways in which often proxies for race or analogies to race, things like immigration status, or more recently, the targeting of Muslim populations, operate with the same logics. And so a lot of my career has been trying to find ways to translate the lessons of CRS that I learned in the CRS program into these new fields. And I'd like to give you, just a couple of examples. So one of the things that we attempted to do in a few years back was challenge the wave of omnibus anti-immigrant laws that were being passed, beginning first with Arizona's SB 1070 in 2010. Now, on the face of this law, it was racially neutral, but there were a lot of proxies for race that were incorporated within the law. There were a lot of ways in which that if you just looked under the surface, under the statements of the legislators, if you looked at the statements of citizens of the state of Arizona who came to speak on behalf of the bill, you could see very racially coded language about immigrants that conflated them with Latinos. So part of what we tried to do there in that case was attempt to bring challenges to the law under kind of traditional kind of civil rights doctrine, including challenging things under the Arlington Heights line of cases that said, well, even if it's not racially discriminatory on its face, we can look to other things like the statements of legislators, the history of the bill, and other things in order to demonstrate the underlying racial animus. And what we really found in cases like this is that much like we learn in CRS, equal protection jurisprudence is kind of fundamentally broken. It becomes extremely difficult to challenge it on these bases. And instead, what we often have to do is turn to other legal theories in order to try to gain some purchase or to find ways to block these laws to achieve what will be the blocking of these laws, which are having a disparate impact on Latino communities and the like. And so there we relied on preemption doctrine. We said, hey, these are legislating in an area related to immigration in ways that have been reserved for the federal government. But here, once again, CRS really helps instruct us in what we're doing, how we're doing it, and hopefully the limits of the arguments we try to make, because we know that many of these doctrines talking about the federal power over immigration and the like, these are really fraught doctrines as well. And these are ones that are created through an immigration jurisprudence that is built on things like the Chinese exclusion cases and others, which really attempts to justify racially discriminatory practices by the federal government as being unreviewable or subject to very limited review. And so this really fast forwards to what I've been doing since about January 25th. 24th of this year, which is a series of beginning with a Friday night in which we received the first of the executive orders issued by President Trump, which attempted to ban individuals from 7 predominantly Muslim countries and was in effect and intention a Muslim ban. And so since that time, my organization, along with others throughout the country, have been engaging in what is essentially trench warfare with the Trump administration to try to block wave after wave of revised executive order. And in doing so, we find ourselves kind of once again running up against many of these same doctrines that attempt to be deployed against us in these cases and against our clients that claim broad power to engage in unreviewable action by the federal government, regardless of the statements, the copious statements, including directly discriminatory statements by the president and his advisors. And so we've been attempting to use additional doctrines. In this case, Establishment Clause doctrine, which in many ways is more favorable to us than equal protection doctrine to attempt to block the administration from engaging in this practice of discriminating against Muslims in this country and abroad, and their families abroad. And so this is kind of my way of saying that, both to answer the question of what are we doing to resist, and I think that I've been very proud to say that this work I found very rewarding, if very tiring, to attempt to stop one of the many egregious practices being done by the Trump administration, but also to highlight the ways in which critical race studies really informs the work we do. And I'd like to close with just one kind of brief example of the way that this informs our work. So we're very lucky. Our case in Maryland, at the most recent hearing that we had, God, when was it? Was it this Monday? No, the Monday before. So there, the judge in that case asked the federal government if it was willing to produce the memo which Trump claims to rely on for this latest iteration of the Muslim ban. And the judge himself raised the specter of Korematsu. So if folks know, in Korematsu, one of the big claims about the case is that, they got it wrong because evidence was withheld from the court, and so they couldn't make a good determination of what's going on. Well, that's kind of like the common narrative, but writers like Jerry Kang here have said, no, it's really a deeper narrative. It's about the court's maneuvers to attempt to evade review when they could have looked at other factors. They could have looked at not just the detention cases, but also the but also the earlier cases which challenged the curfews. And he really critiqued the courts for failing to accept their judicial responsibility. So when we engage in our briefing and we engage in our arguments, we try to emphasize that the courts can't just ignore, one piece of evidence, but they can't also ignore their responsibility to attempt to block such blatantly discriminatory measures as the latest ban.
How do you follow that, right? I think I can follow that by kind of facing up to the mistakes I've made and the difficulties I'm having. So I noticed that in this excellent panel, one question that have not been answered, and perhaps it's because I'm the one who's messing up the most. I almost said the F word. I'm a litigator, so that's what I do. I say 4-letter words, very familiar to me. So there's a question about the gaps or holes in our practice, and I will address that. But in order to talk about it, I think I need to talk about two things first. They may or may not be connected later on, but let's see. So the way that I try to think about and apply the principles that I learned in CRS is the first principle is always this: look to the bottom. And I think it's something that Hussain touched on and Devon touched on as well. It's like we all touched on that. How is people with this direct experience of racism and the racist system are the ones we need to listen to the most. Now, so for instance, I will take on cases that I don't initially at least believe in because our clients say that those are important. And I don't see the importance of it, but I trust that there's importance somewhere. And I'll take those on, and inevitably I'll say, oh shit, I'm sorry. Oh shit, that was awesome that we did this in that case. And sometimes, I will. So I can spend too much time on this. And the second one that we try to do is. We actually have a larger kind of a systematic racism kind of a framework first. So we think of the entire criminal justice system as a kind of a new Jim Crow, for those of you who are familiar with that term now, the new Jim Crow. Michelle Alexander, that book was instantly familiar to a lot of us working in the criminal justice field, even before we read it, because that's the practice, that's the experience of our clients. And A New Way of Life, the work that I'm at, carved out a particular kind of section of this criminal justice system to attack, and that has to do with the collateral consequences of criminal record. So we try to dismantle it. Catherine mentioned the Fair Chance Initiative, what we call Ban the Box. And so that's something that was very community grassroots oriented. It was grown out of that organization, or organizing rather, and it is basically sweeping the nation, so to speak. It just passed, AB 1008, just passed in California. It's the law now as of January 1st of next year. So awesome. And by the way, the enforcement of that goes to the Department of Fair Employment and Housing. So, yeah, hey. But anyways, so we try to attack that. We try to make